Hello, and welcome to Talking with Machines. I'm Mark Corbett Wilson, a lifelong learner and retired high-tech glassblower. I spent 2 decades working in Surveillance Valley, making gas lasers and lamps to support the manufacture of computer chips. Now I'm a critical digital humanist, the learning technologian at the Western Institute for Social Research in Berkeley, California, and a facilitator and digital storyteller with StoryCenter.org. In sum, I'm an educator who helps people glean meaning from their experiences and tell stories. Today I'm joined by Bryan Alexander and Tom Haymes. Gentlemen, please introduce yourselves.
I'm Bryan Alexander. I'm a futurist specializing in the future of higher education. I'm currently a senior scholar at Georgetown University.
And I'm Tom Haymes. I'm a startup founder of Idea Spaces and the Knowledge Navigator. I'm also an educator and author and consultant. So I do a lot of different things, and I've been in the education field for over 2 decades now.
Thank you. And today we're going to focus on Tom's recent post, "The AI Revolution Will Be Small." Tom, you want to start us off?
Yeah, so what motivated me to write this particular blog post was all of the furor last week over the DeepSeek announcement and the subsequent effects on the stock market and other kinds of conversations, and of course the national security implications, quote unquote, of DeepSeek and whatnot. And I was very frustrated with the tone of the conversation in most of these cases because they very much uh, focused on this idea that somehow AI was this big monolithic thing. And of course, we've dealt with most of the models that most people deal with on a day-to-day basis are large models like ChatGPT and Genesis from Google and Claude from Perplexity, and I think that that's kind of a poor way of thinking about where AI could potentially be going, and also most importantly, where its true power lies. Um, and it also got me thinking back to, the kind of conversations that were happening in the 60s and 50s, 60s, and 70s around computing and what people thought computing was going to look like in the future. And in those days, the idea was bigger was better, and that or bigger was where things were going to go. If you read the science fiction of the time, and Bryan and I are both science fiction aficionados, and look at stories from Isaac Asimov or Frederick Brown or the fabulous movie Colossus, the Forbin Project. All of those computers are huge, right? They're world-spanning, massive computers, and the idea is that to get the maximum computing power, you make the biggest computer in the world, and that turned out to be a really bad vision of the future. And IBM bet on that future and lost. And the real revolution, the real power came not from the computers themselves, but giving their power to individuals, to individual imaginations, to thousands or millions of people, including the three of us, but also including every tech founder of these large companies, from Google to Apple to Mr. Musk, et cetera, et cetera. All of them started in a PC world, and that gave them their initial power and thrust into their current prosperity. So it was the smallness of the revolution that really shifted the firmament of computing and human society, not the bigness of it. And I don't see any reason to believe that AI will be any different, because the basic idea of human creativity and as Doug Engelbart liked to put it, augmenting human intellect is a person by person project, and it's the collective will and advantage that we give to individuals that will push society and technology forward. AI, the revolution that ChatGPT launched on the world wasn't AI, because AI has been around for a while. It wasn't a new thing, but what was really revolutionary about it was suddenly that everybody could suddenly access it and play with it. And we've seen some really amazing things coming from not just ChatGPT, but also from the other things, the other models, et cetera, that are out there. we've seen these amazing things come from, individual creativity that has been empowered by these tools. And that's what gets me truly excited is empowering human beings because human beings are what matters, right? So that's kind of what the article was about. And I think a lot of the conversations around we're at war with China over AI and or this company's at war with this company over AI, blah blah blah. Who's got the better model, et cetera, et cetera. Well, you know what? At the end of the day, that huge horsepower advantage that some models have over others or whatever, blah blah blah, doesn't really matter because you know uh, not everybody needs a Ferrari for one thing. A lot of us drive Toyotas or Mazdas in my case. So, these are good cars that get us to where we need to be. And the same thing is true of an AI. I need a tool to help me do X, Y, or Z. And if it can help me do that better, then I'm a winner, as a human being. So that's what kind of the short or overly long version of what I was talking about in the blog, but just sort of in general my thinking on the subject. So off to whoever wants
Right.
to tear into that.
Bryan,
Mark,
go ahead.
well, I was actually going to ask you to do this because I'm wondering, I mean, you have two phases of your life which overlap, which may give insight into this. One is in your current phase of life, you're doing a lot of work with digital education. And so this is giving you quite a glimpse into questions of size and scale. But in your previous life, as you mentioned in our introduction, you worked on glass blowing. I'm wondering if there are any insights or parallels you can draw from either of those worlds in terms of the question of the value of scale, the value of size, rather, from the very large to the small.
Well, I was just checking. Not long after I got to what I now call Surveillance Valley, I prefer the older term, the Valley of Heart's Delight, when it was a center of fruit packing and shipping.
Yeah.
Um, but when I got there in 1989, it was already established, but yet it was still the smaller entrepreneurial startups surrounding the big players. HP is hardly mentioned anymore in my world, but yet HP was the model. In fact, it was called the HP way that we were all imitating with our owners in the factory, walking around, open door policy. In fact, two of the companies that I worked the longest for, um, 14 years in one case and 16 part-time in the other, literally had offices with sliding glass doors that were always open. They only closed the door when, documents were being signed or contracts were being negotiated. And that was the HP way. And they were non-hierarchical. As I love to point out to all my educators, my whole life I worked for companies that had zero administrators. You had the owners who were in the shop with the workers, and we all just
Mm,
did our job,
nice.
which I find just confuses it's the institutionalized, as I like to refer to them. Um, so yeah, I did get to see the inside, the how the sausage is made. Um, the personal computer did change everything. I do like to remember that I wrote my first program on an IBM 360, which now I'm questioning if I ever even saw that machine. It was in the mid 70s, and we used punch cards to write a Fortran program. And, we gave those to the technician, and the technician fed those into the card reader that produced the paper tape. And then when he ran the tape, an error would come up and it would tell you that card three had an error. And it was a night class, weekly night class. And you would come back the next week with the error in card three fixed, and then it would say, well, you got an error in card four. So it took several weeks to get the simplest program to run.
Hmm.
So that's when I decided, no, I'm a glassblower. I'm not a programmer. Um, but then again, I got to, thanks to the Reagan administration and their recessions, I guess, they're never really long lasting. So I call them the Reagan recessions. I went back to school to study manufacturing engineering because I was seriously interested in glassblowing at that point. And I got my hands on the original IBM PC. And it was a similar experience. I took a basic uh, class and learned how to program in BASIC on a PC. But I never imagined the internet. I mean, that was in the early 80s, and nobody said, hey, there's this internet thing. And if you went to UCLA or Stanford or MIT or one of the schools that were linked together, you could learn more about it. But again, so I just went back to glassblowing. Um, so I think I'm wandering here, but this is just to say that I've been watching this a long time, and everybody getting their own computer definitely changed everything. As Tom said, it's the distribution or the democratization that really changed things. And although, and again, we don't hear much about supercomputing anymore. There was that decade or so when it was the rage, in the news. I mean, again, it's an ongoing project for decades, but it was much talked about. And then we don't hear so much about that. I was always interested in the SETI program where
Hmm.
you could sign up, and I guess hundreds of thousands of people signed up and said, "Yeah, you can use my computer at night." And so there are these different approaches, and I'm going to agree with Tom here and say that the DeepSeek really offered an opportunity for people to try a much smaller program. And my guess is that's going to revolutionize things the way the home personal computer did. I'm going to agree with Tom on that. So I don't know if that's what you were looking for, Bryan. Um,
That's definitely uh, the kind of thinking I was hoping for. I mean, I think that opens up a lot of what Tom was thinking about. I mean, for example, your question about time, about having to go through the repeated steps, punch cards. Uh, makes you think this is in part a question of time as well as space. That you're able to get a faster turnaround time, or it's easier to debug and develop. You reminded me of the way that 3D printing works now, where to do anything significant, it usually takes hours for the printer to do. So you develop it, you develop a model, you hit print, and then you go away, for a day or a night and come back and get it, and then you have to do it again. There's a speed up in time that can happen as well as a increased access in space. I also really liked the way you described the HP way kind of gave a reverse description where the smaller groups or the older groups have the closer connection in space between staff and owners and managers, whereas now that's often more distanced, both hierarchically as well as in space. Um, Thank you. I appreciate it. I do wonder though, I mean, thinking about glass blowing technology as well as thinking about 3D printing as a way of getting at AI. I wonder if we don't have a kind of we have a technological curve where things get smaller and faster, and then we hit a limit or we hit a level where things stay on that level for a while. I'm thinking about cars, for example, which have gotten more efficient and safer and stronger and longer range and all this over decades, but also kind of hit the sedan size is kind of where things stopped. I mean, and there are three-wheel cars and of course motorcycles, but it just didn't get below that. And I'm thinking it with glass blowing. No one ever made a glass blowing technology, that's pocket size. You hit that kind of level. 3D printing is the same way. It's over the past decade, it's gotten way more efficient, cheaper, faster. But you're still looking at about the same size, that cube, maybe a meter on the size of machine. Um, I mean, so this, for those of you who don't know me, I teach a class on a seminar at Georgetown on technology and technology theory. So I always look to history and other technologies as a way of getting at what's going on with the current technology. And I wonder, if until DeepSeek, it really looked like the giant industrial scale machine was really the only way to do AI. That's where a lot of the objections came from, especially from the climate side, for example, as well as the copyright side, to say, yeah, this is huge scale, it's emitting lots of carbon to make, and of course, it's committing copyright violations at an unprecedented level. And maybe that's where we're stuck. Well, High Flyer pumped out DeepSeek version 3, and now it's we don't need so much, and we can get a pretty decent level. So maybe, maybe Tom, where you're pointing this out quite accurately, that we're pointing towards smaller and smaller generative AI. And this is just to be clear, this is the whole production sequence from from training through publication to where it can serve as a service. This isn't just using it. This is the whole production side. Um, I and then the question is, how much further does it go? When is the next DeepSeek? When do we get AI which can be trained on fewer and fewer GPUs with fewer and fewer cycles and less electricity?
So,
So if I
I
could just drop another
yeah,
anecdote in, Tom, first.
sure.
One of my favorite observations on the manufacture of semiconductor chips is when I started industrial glass blowing, scientific glass blowing, high-tech glass blowing. I call it all different things. I really don't know what to call it. If you say glass blowing, people just think of the things that they've seen at the carnival, or maybe now on TV with the glass blowing challenge thing. I can't remember the name of it. Um, so there are, that's to say there are many types of glass blowing. And when I started, the silicon wafers, well, silicon wafers are grown inside of a pure fused quartz environment. And pure fused quartz really isn't glass, but they uh, got us glass blowers to learn how to work with it. And so we call that glass too, even though it's not. But that's another story. But when I started, the silicon crystals that were grown in the quartz tubes were limited by the size of the quartz tubes. And it takes tremendous amount of energy and all sorts of engineering and manufacturing skill to make these quartz tubes that us glassblowers would take and fashion into the apparatus needed. And so when I started, they were about 2.5 inches in diameter. And over my couple of decades, they got to the point, and again, I've been out for 20 years, but they sort of hit a limit at around 12, 14 inches in diameter that the manufacturers could make. But then there were glass blowers who wore those silver suits that you see at uh, auto racing
Mhm,
with
mhm, mhm.
huge shields, and they would. And there's, all the equipment is specially manufactured, of course. So the manufacturers made these giant glass lathes where you could feed those 14-inch quartz tubes in one end, and the glass blower would reshape those into 24-inch bell jars that they would grow the silicon crystals in. So I'm really not sure what the largest size wafer is now. So the silicon crystal is then micro sliced into these wafers, and that's where you put the metals to make it semiconductive, because silicon is non-conductive and the metals on top are semiconductive. And so the entire industry was limited by the size of the quartz tubes, is my point. Um, and so I can relate that to this idea of these huge models that we've been wrestling with. And in my experience, they're not getting it much better. Um, Tom mentions Claude AI, which is from Anthropic. That's
Sorry,
the one I
yeah.
settled on, and which Google invested in because now Google's Gemini is powered by Anthropic's Claude AI. So again, everything's converging. So we're used to that. The corporate convergence and the technological convergence. Um, but again, I think, as Tom has pointed out, that the real revolution is the small ones that are more widely distributed. And there's a hope that we will decentralize this style of computing the way the personal computers decentralize what we called computing before then. So I just want to drop that in to follow up on Bryan, but thanks, Tom.
Well, no,
Yeah.
that's a great insight. And I do wonder if we could take this further, Tom. What would a decentralized LLM look like? What's decentralized AI look like?
Well, I mean, so when I say that, I don't mean that it all combines into some hive mind or something like that. Although that could be a possibility. Remember the SETI screensavers
Yeah,
we used to have 20 years ago?
that's what you were
Uh,
mentioning, Mark, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that what I'm saying is this is about empowering what's between our ears to do new and exciting and creative things and liberate us from the drudge, a lot of the drudgery that is inflicted upon us by living in an industrial world, where everything has to be made to, in a machine standard at a certain level. And everything from, right. There's another conversation to be had here as far as, and I was listening to a person from HP the other day talk about how they use AI at HP. And of all the people on this particular panel that I was listening to, her ideas were the least creative and transformative, which I thought was um, okay. Hey, we can use it to write memos so that people can do more work and other things. I'm like, okay, you know, what does this tell you about the value of the memos that you're writing in the first place? But you know,
Sure, sure.
how much of an industrial writing output, if you go into an office, do people ever actually read again, right? Um, I think that actually that's kind of a waste because there's a lot of stored knowledge there. But the reality is it goes into a filing cabinet and you never see it for. Didn't you read what was it, the TP55 memo from Office Space or whatever? You know,
Right, right,
yeah.
right, right.
Um, and but I had a question based on what Bryan was talking about a little earlier. You and I both love to study technological transformations. If you were to try to step back and say where we are right now in terms of AI and how society is adapting to it. I know you have the two levels of technology adoption. In the first level, you're copying the old technology, you're copying old practice with the new technology, making it more efficient. In the second level, it transforms the practice. I see an awful lot of level one stuff going on. And when people complain about AI, it's usually because it's not doing the level one stuff as well as they want it to.
Mm-hmm.
And all of these debates about it's replacing musicians, it's replacing artists, it's replacing writing, it's going to drive these people, um, yeah, it's replacing crappy musicians and crappy artists and things like that who mass produce, music, right? But those have already started getting pushed out. And I say this as a photographer myself, as an artist, those people have been were already being pushed by realities of GarageBand. Anybody can make music now with GarageBand, and I've listened to artists complain about how crappy the music is that comes out of GarageBand. Well, some of it is, a lot of it is, but there's also some gems in there. So, but I want to get to this larger point of, where exactly do you think we are, Bryan, in terms of the transition from the horseless carriage to the automobile?
Definitely in phase one. And so just in case listeners haven't heard this, and I really need to write this up more seriously, I thought I found this idea in Janet Murray actually, but I think I may have just used
I've never
Remus.
found it there. I looked for it.
Some ideas that any technology adoption proceeds in a two-step process. In the first step, we copy and paste practices and techniques from that we already know. And in the second stage, we actually embrace the technology and use it for what it can do intrinsically. So an example would be film. For example, early film where you have a lot of static images where the camera is still, much like it's in theater, and people are made up heavily like they are on
You're
stage and
talking
on
about motion picture film.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Okay. Just to
Not camera.
clarify.
No,
Yeah.
no, absolutely, you're right. You're absolutely right. Not camera film. The not photography as such. And then if people figured out, well, you guys should pick up the camera and move, and then you could do some aggressive editing, and then you can add special effects, and suddenly it becomes something new. I went through that in a lot of ways. If you look at the 1990s, a lot of the web kind of imitates print have pages, a metaphor from print, and you actually have page numbers on some web pages. And then with web, what we used to call Web 2.0, we actually started embracing micro content and writability, trying to embrace Search Berners-Lee's original version of a read-write web. And I think with generative AI, we're definitely in that first mode right now. We're trying to fit it into pre-existing boxes. The making stuff is really the kind of step one. And we're just using it to pump out images, pump out songs, pump out ebooks, and like with the like with the first stage of any, this has some validity to it. This has some utility. But I think we're seeing glimpses of what it can do that's different from that stage one. The use of AI as the companion bot use. I want to be careful about not being too anthropomorphic, but the idea of treating it as a conversational partner, I think, is something that's very, very different from, say, our use of Google or even WordPress. And along with that, I think is facilitation of simulations. I think that's its real, a hidden superpower, and that I think takes us into some a very, very different world. Um, and it may be that we get smaller and smaller technology, meaning that more and more people figure out these uses. I think about radio, how radio went really quickly from big lab machines to crystal sets that people could make, and as a result, in the 1920s, we had this boom of radio creativity of people inventing radio theater. In the U.S., I mean, we tramped it down pretty hard with the Radio Acts under Hoover, and we really radio still in many ways hasn't recovered in the U.S. from that. That added huge licensing, which put a major barrier on entry. That added the FCC's police force, which is largely comical to think about, except for one Christian Slater movie. And in many ways, in the 1990s, that's how people thought of the then growing internet and then the then nascent web. They wanted to
Mhm.
control it that way, which was a precedent. And TV had followed a very similar pattern. And TV also, like film, movies, had enormous capital investments in order to make at the time. And so they were very lowercase d undemocratic in that sense. AI is potentially making that switch now. Now it's at the studio level where you have to have 20th Century Fox or something in order to be able to make an AI. But maybe we're pushing further and further down that slope. And then we can have individuals, eventually individuals, but in the meantime, smaller and smaller groups. I mean, before I forecast individual religions having their own AIs, Mormon AI, Catholic AI. We haven't seen that yet, but that would be in many ways a pretty smart thing to do. And we have seen some fun things like there was a Swiss church which put out its own digital priest, which is pretty fun. But I think, but that was using somebody else's tool.
Yeah, we
I
talked
think,
about that last time.
yeah, I think people creating their own, that's a possibility. That's a road that's ahead. Now, I'm very concerned about the CO2 footprint and the water usage of generative AI. And I think what you've described, Tom, is a great direction for that. Reducing the amount of computing needed, so reducing the amount of CO2 emitted, reducing the amount of water needed for cooling. I think that's a great direction.
I mean, I don't see that as a strategy. I see that as a natural evolution, and as long as we don't somehow throttle that. The other
But that's why
now,
that's why I don't think it's natural. I
yeah,
think it's a tendency, and we have the capacity to do this, but we can throttle it. I mean, the radio example I mentioned before, and we can think of some benign throttlings, right? Like we throttled
yeah.
nuclear power, and I'm pretty glad we did. Not in the I mean I mean in the democratic use of nuclear power. I'm really glad individual high school students don't make nuclear piles, but
But on the other hand, by throttling nuclear power, we also encourage the coal industry.
yeah, no, I meant at the level of individual usage.
Yeah.
And we actually encouraged atomic power in terms of building plants for a long time, and other countries did as well, especially France. But I think not giving every person access to nuclear weapons is probably a good thing.
But I mean, we also don't have individual steel plants either. So I mean, there's some things that are not going to downsize from their industrial size. We may have
Yeah.
automated, but
Well, that's
uh,
that level I was wondering about before. I mean, you can do iron plants at a smaller scale, but they produce pretty bad iron. Mao
yeah.
found out.
Well, I
Uh,
think that's a different, yeah. I mean, I'm not saying that what I'm thinking of is going to apply to every industry. I am just saying that when it comes to tools of as our friend Howard Rheingold put it, tools for thought, that dissemination that's making things small is something that is incredibly powerful. And that's the vision that Doug Engelbart had. It's a vision that, Ted Nelson have, in terms of liberating us from the computer priesthood, as Ted Nelson put it.
Yeah.
Um,
Yes.
the
I always
but I,
like to remember that in early radio, recordings were prohibited, that all broadcast music had to be performed by musicians in the union.
yeah.
Um, and, so I get the same vibe as these different shifts occur,
Hmm.
and people try to limit the use. And somehow people get their hands on the technology one way or the other.
Have you
Uh,
ever read Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward?
I've looked at it. I haven't read it.
Well, the idea there is that there is no radio, but that they have these set of tubes which broadcast live performances, and you can switch from one performance to another.
I'd really recommend the unbelievably good movie, The Death of Stalin.
Oh
Um,
yeah,
and there's a open. Have you seen this, Mark?
No, I haven't.
it's
It's
hilarious.
it's when you describe the movie, it sounds impossible, and the movie feels impossible every minute. It's on the knife edge of extreme horror and comedy, and it stays on that edge like a skater the whole way through. It's a historical comedy about the aftermath of Stalin's death. I'm not making this up, but in the beginning, before this is what you remind me of. Before Stalin dies, we get a performance, 1953 in Moscow, of a great piece of classical music. I've just forgotten which one it is. Symphony orchestra plays it, and then and there's an audience. They applaud politely, and then the this is recorded and played live on radio, and the back after the performance is done, one of the engineers gets a call, and it's Stalin. He was listening, and he loved the performance and wanted to know if it was recorded, and it wasn't recorded.
Yes.
So the engineers panic to figure what can they do. So they immediately run out and tell the orchestra you to play it again, which is a big ask, but they can do it. But then the engineers realize, oh no, that's going to mess with the audience is gone, and that's going to mess with the acoustics of the performance. So we need to quickly fill an audience. So they have to like run out into the street and just grab people off the street and tell them Stalin wants you to listen to the symphony, and they bring them in. It goes further, um, but if I can go back, Tom, to your China point, I think this does fit into the U.S.-China rivalry. By this, I don't mean Stalin. I mean DeepSeek. This does fit into the U.S.-China rivalry in some interesting ways. Um, there's a We don't have enough information about DeepSeek's actual production to tell enough about how it actually built how Highflyer actually built the tool. But it looks like they were forced to innovate because of rising U.S. chip restrictions and export controls. And that, of course, is part of the bipartisan strategy in the U.S. of treating China as a global adversary. And this goes all the way back to Obama's first administration. Uh, so that's an interesting response. I mean, in terms of innovation studies, this is a classic case of innovation under constraint. Now, it's possible that the CEO of Highflyer went off and basically scored a big box of GPUs, high-powered ones, and used them. And that may have had some role in this. But it's interesting to think about, will the US and China now diverge this way? I mean, will we see the US continue along the lines of very expensive, big iron projects for AI, and China continue to innovate on the light side? Uh, I mean, this one of the reasons this is so dramatic is because the week before DeepSeek, went viral with their iOS version, uh, the U.S. had just announced the Project Stargate. So
Yeah.
this is another one of our science fiction references for our show. And Stargate involved, I mean, they were calling for up to $500 billion in investment for basically for infrastructure to roll out more and more AI. And when Stargate went nuts, then the stock market freaked out and punished. I mean, Nvidia lost $600 billion in valuation. I mean, just an amazing, amazing loss. But some of that's been recovered. Microsoft and Google recovered as well. So it looks like maybe we have these two different versions. I mean, what complicates this is Meta, because Meta makes Llama, which is largely, not completely, depending on how you define the open source. And so Meta has been kind of saying, yeah, well, we were right to do this in open source. But it is interesting to see this as part of the geopolitical framework. And the one little sign of that, and then I'll stop, is Senator Hawley, not one of my favorites, um, posted a bill to fine anybody in the U.S. who's basically using DeepSeek. And it's kind of echo of the bills against TikTok. So we're seeing that non-technological geopolitical dimension starting to have more and more impacts on technology, including AI.
Yeah, and I think yeah, the national security issues aside, um, I, I honestly, I would probably not recommend the Pentagon start using DeepSeek. But yeah, I mean, I think people don't realize at some level. Now, some of the in terms of what they're putting into these LLMs and where that's going and how much it's hashed and et cetera, and how easy it is to extract it back out again in its original form. When I used to work years and years ago, I worked in the open source intelligence business, and one of the lessons I learned there was the questions you ask are every bit as much as important as the information you get, because when you ask a question, you're telling the other person what you don't know. And so that was always that made for some very interesting conversations with people, because how do you get the
Mm,
information you want without actually asking it, right?
yeah.
um, but I want to steer back toward AI and technology transformations real quick.
Can we
One of
put a
the
pin in that, Tom? I just wanted to say that I
Yeah.
had the opportunity working in Santa Clara, California, to watch them dismantle the Intel production facility and
Hmm.
ship it to China. And me and my buddies were like, this doesn't look good.
Wow.
And yet
Was
we
it mainland
managed.
China or Taiwan?
Well, I'm not clear on that. It was probably Taiwan.
Yeah.
But then that expanded, and it's in multiple locations, but not in California or the US. And we were worried, and then we realized that we were such a specialized group making these high-powered lamps that are used in microphotolithography, that we were fine for the time anyway. And then there was across the street from us was a large, a city block size distribution center where trucks came and went all day. Who knows what they were distributing? I have no idea. And we watched that get torn down, and up
Hmm.
went a 8 or 10 story glass building with the NVIDIA logo on it. And we were
Mm,
like, oh, things are changing,
yeah.
in materially changing. And
Yes.
so I just want to drop that in there that, and here we are. So back then, China was our friend, and now they're trying to say China's our enemy because they're doing what we asked them to do, and nobody seems to remember that. So I just have to point that out
We've
that
always been at war with Eurasia. What's wrong with you?
exact,
Well, it's
exactly.
I mean, you can date it pretty clearly. You have uh, President Clinton, and then both Presidents Bush, um, you know, well, no, sorry, Bush W, welcoming China into the World Trade Organization, into the global market, and making the big bet that if China does capitalism at scale, it's going to do representative democracy at scale. And this bet turned out to be wrong. And so you get
For now.
well, so far, I mean, for some period of time, Obama ran 2008 in part on a foreign policy of pivoting to Asia, and pivoting to Asia meant pivoting against China. And he implemented that. He fought really hard for it. Some of his bipartisan successes came from that. And then, in his wacky, clumsy, dangerous way, Trump followed suit. And then Biden took it even further and further.
Hmm.
Trump, so far in the past few weeks, hasn't done really anything about China, but it was front loaded in Project 2025, and it was in his a platform, and so I expect to see more of that.
Yeah. I mean, and yeah, geopolitics aside, and by the way, DeepSeek is not the first small model. I think it's approachable in a way that, at least as far as their interface is concerned. But I mean, some of the ones that our friend Ruben, like Mistral and
Mhm.
Libra and others, are small models.
That's true.
He's given us a number to look at that don't necessarily need to dim a small city every time you run a query. Um,
The thing is, none of them has reached the quality level of DeepSeek. I mean,
no,
that's
yeah.
that's the big thing. Uh,
Well, yeah, yeah, exactly. But I'm not saying it's not it's an important breakthrough in terms of how the models work. But I'm saying that that's going to happen, and DeepSeek isn't going to be the last of those either. But that actually relates back to what I was going to say a minute ago, is that to me, the more interesting things, I look at AI as an engine, and I want to see the car. And I don't feel like in many cases we're seeing very useful cars yet. I think that ChatGPT is a rather chat engines generally, all of them with the chat shell, whatever you want to call it, is a rather rudimentary set of bodywork around an engine. It's the original Mercedes Benz with the hand tiller, but we're still
Chatbots. Yeah.
yeah, but we're still getting to a point where a car becomes transportation as opposed to something to show off to your neighbors. And I look at things like Notebook LM, which is a set of bodywork around Genesis, the Google Genesis AI.
Gemini.
Uh, Gemini, sorry, Gemini. God, I'm just doing it all over the place today. I messed up Anthropic earlier too. My apologies there. Um, I'm older than Brian. That's what I'm going to say. Um, um, but that to me, Notebook is really interesting. It doesn't need a lot of computing power, but I have done more useful things with Notebook in the last 2 months than I have done with ChatGPT in the last 2 years.
hmm.
And it's because of the fact that I have much more control over the environment in an easily accessible way. I all heart and respect out to our friend Ruben. Do not have time to mess around with stuff like he does, which I think is important work. And when I need that information, I definitely reach out to him. But I'm trying to get stuff done, and Notebook has made it easier for me to get stuff done. I've documented a fair amount of that in my blogs over the last couple of months, talking about that, and also where I'm trying to go with my own efforts, my own company, and achieving serendipity. I don't think it does that very well yet, but I think that's I would love to be talking to the guys at Notebook because of that reason. For that reason, that I think there's a lot of synergies between what I'm thinking about doing and what I'm trying to do, and what they're already starting to do. But it's again, that's a small model. It doesn't use a lot of horsepower. I am providing the data. They're providing the tool for the connections because I'm uploading my own work. I'm uploading articles and stuff that I own into it, and using and doing running analyses on that, looking for comparisons. I uploaded my book and Brian's book, and I said, "Give me a list of things that we have in common." And I thought it was a rather interesting list. I think I shared that with you. I don't know if you looked at it, but you know, uh, and I want to know, what do these two seemingly unconnected things have in common? That to me is exciting. That's where innovation happens, where new ideas come from. It's, you know, don't cross the streams. Yes, cross the streams. Cross the streams every
Well,
day and all day long. So yeah,
let me ask you about
yeah.
that. I want to come back to your chassis idea. But why is Notebook LM better for that than say any text chatbot?
Well, because again, the problem with ChatGPT that people like to complain about is the fact that they don't often know where all this information is coming from or how it's put, the hallucinations problem. It's gotten better because you can get sources out of it in a way that you couldn't originally. But I want to, I want to be able to control the extent, the breadth of the exploration that I'm doing, because
I'm
sometimes
gonna
you be able to control the experiment.
I want
And
to say the magic words, Tom.
yeah,
hold that thought. Retrieval augmented generation,
Yes.
RAG.
And that's what
That's what
Notebook LM,
Notebook LM is.
right.
Can,
Sorry to
can,
interrupt.
Rag.
no,
Yes.
hold on. I want to come back to that,
Yeah.
Mark, for a second, but I want to press you on this because I think there's something else going on here. Um, I can ask Perplexity, Claude, Gemini, ChatGPT, DeepSeek to do the kind of exercise you're talking about. I can upload, big chunks of text and have it ingest them and play with them. Is the advantage that Notebook has that it is oral rather than textual, and that the oral nature is much more personable, that you clearly have two different voices, which are, recognizably two different people, whereas most of these chatbots are persona-less.
No, I mean, okay, so I would divorce the oral stuff is interesting, but not for the reasons you just said. Okay.
Okay.
You're
Um,
referring to the generated
the
podcast, right,
generated
Bryan?
podcast,
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
which is two for people who haven't used it. It's two voices, a man and a woman. Put quotes around those if you like. Talking. They're talking through the response to your query.
And I find from the perspective of human connection, it's a little bit like talking to Eliza. It's not a very human experience. They're very artificial. They're very white, and they're very and there's weird social dynamics going on that I'm sure that may or may not be coded into it, but somehow it's picked up on. The woman is always the one asking the questions, for instance, and the man has all
Huh.
the answers and stuff like that. You
Oh,
see these patterns of stuff,
oh.
the kind of stuff that would get you fired at most modern workplaces. But the It does a good job of mansplaining in the short version. The
Huh.
interesting thing about the orality of it, though, is that of all of the ways that it works, the textual conversations and stuff, I honestly think the synthesis works the best when it has to create a synthesized narrative. If you run text queries and try to get it to achieve synthesis, it can be a bit of a struggle. And that's where I think that's the weird thing. I can't quite figure out why that is. I think it actually, no, I think I know why it is. I think it is because in order to talk like I'm doing right now, we have to synthesize all the time. We're synthesizing the language itself, our choice of words, the information we're drawing on, and we somehow have to mash that up and make it intelligible. And that's what it's trying to do with the podcast to a greater or lesser level of success. But I think it's honestly better, whereas text can be chopped. In other words, that you can look at you can slice and dice text in a way it's much harder to slice and dice narrative. I mean, yes, you can take narrative out of context, but that's the whole point is that you're taking it out of context. You've lost something there, right? Or you've gained something if you're trying to frame me up for saying something stupid. But the
I think
interest,
it's the boundaries that you're laying down.
yeah,
By feeding it the up to 50
yeah.
inputs, you're creating these boundaries and you're pushing the AI down a level and
Hmm.
saying work within these boundaries. Also,
And that's exactly what I was going to say. Yeah,
yeah,
go ahead. Sorry.
okay.
Yeah.
And, it also takes multiple input uh, file types. So you're
Hmm.
not limited to text. Because it's a Google product, you can drop in YouTube videos,
You are limited to text because what it's doing with the YouTube is it's parsing the
taking the
transcript.
transcription. Yeah.
It's not actually, it won't tell you about the color of the background and why that's significant or
No,
not.
that's true.
So,
Hmm.
But it
Hmm.
will accept the different file types.
yeah,
Um,
it's
and
basically
so,
working from a text. It
yeah,
can't handle imagery, for instance, for real.
right. But, again, that will evolve. But yeah, I think it's the boundedness that helps it um, focus, if you want to put it that way, or limit its responses to those foundational texts
Yeah.
above the model.
Yeah, I mean, I've been sort of trying to get it to trip. I mean, I uploaded what was it? I think it was Nick Susanis's Unflattened, which is a
Yeah.
graphic,
Yeah.
it's a doctoral dissertation on the power of imagery and visual thinking. And I think what it did is it stripped out all the text, which is weird, to be honest, because it doesn't really work if you do that. But no, I mean, I think when the things where I found it to be really useful, though, like yesterday, I was trying to find some good quotes about the power of small computing. And I have a database where I basically loaded up a bunch um, uh, of books about things written by everybody from Doug Engelbart all the way to like this Valley of Genius, which is an oral history of Silicon Valley, and I can run searches and I say, find me every instance of the word small in this book, or compare the idea in this book to all the other books, or something like that. And I can run these queries in such a way that it is essentially analyzing, extracting ideas, as I like to say. I call it an idea extraction machine. That's really what I'm trying to get to here. Uh, and and to me, that's not the same thing as just using a chatbot. It's really about, okay, I need to really understand what is going on in this book, or I need to understand how this book relates to other books. And I can use that as I can pin it down, like I can pin it on the mat and I can say, talk to me about this book, and then and then it will actually, and it will also give you direct citations and pop up the text and say, here's the quote I'm working off of. So you can go back and look at that in a way that I think is really useful, because you don't, it's possible to have too much information. As a matter of fact, we suffer from that all the time. Um, and that I talked about this last week when I talked about deconstructing the book in my blog from last week. And the problems with the book as a form factor, in a sense, for storing ideas. It's incredibly useful and good in many contexts, but I want to be able, there are a lot of books that have very little information in them, but that one nugget of good idea might be the thing I really need. But where the hell did I read that before? Or where did I find that? And so that's the kind of thing where if I can upload that book into something like Notebook LM and deconstruct the book and pull out, okay, these are the three good ideas that are in this book, and the rest of it's just filler, which, many books are like that. I have many books where the bookmark is on page 30 or 40, and I got that far, and I'm like, okay, I know what this guy's going to say. I'm done. Time to move on.
BLDR.
But it's a very inefficient process, and but also this idea of being able to connect up. The problem with Bryan sitting in front of his bookshelf, the problem with bookshelves is organizing them, right? How do you organize? We have long conversations about how to organize your bookshelf.
Oh, by color, obviously.
So Tom,
Yeah,
thinking about this,
yeah,
I think this is lovely, and what you've described, Notebook LM doing, that it's and it might be unique right now that nobody else has done this.
yeah. I mean, I don't know. I haven't heard of anybody else doing it for sure.
Well,
This
that's just
reminds me of when I tell people I'm a digital humanist, and they say, well, what's that?
right.
And I say, well, you remember not so much lately, but decades ago, you'd see a article in a magazine or a newspaper that said they discovered a new script by Shakespeare. And then they gave it to the experts, and the experts analyzed it. There's the word, analyzed it, and said yes or no. Most of the time, no, that's not written by Shakespeare.
Yeah.
And the way they analyzed it was using computers and um, language modeling, I don't know, I guess proprietary programs, to then compare the newly discovered text to the entire corpus of Shakespeare that they fed
Hmm.
into the machine,
Hmm.
like Notebook LM, you know, like a RAG, a RAG. They would compare the new document to that, and if it didn't match at a very high percentage level, then they could say with confidence, no, that's not by Shakespeare. We don't hear that much anymore because I think people gave up trying to pass off fake Shakespeare documents. Um, but that's digital humanities in a nutshell to me. And it sounds like Notebook LM is really democratizing that type of work.
That's one part of digital humanities, but that's a very powerful analogy. Um, if this is the case, if we put all these together, I mean, then we have we really have a good chassis, a good stage two example
Hmm.
for LLMs. I do wonder.
Notebook LM is still got issues. I don't want to sit there and say it's the panacea,
Oh, it's early
but
days.
I,
I think it's representative of people starting to build interesting bodies around the
yeah,
engines that are AI.
no, I
And I'm less worried about the engines because frankly, we don't all need Ferraris.
yeah,
Most
you
of us
mentioned
are
it
fine
before.
with Toyotas. And so,
And so what we're talking about, using your analogy, Brian, um, that we're just buying an engine or renting an engine, and you're looking to build something out of it. I'm reminded of Henry Ford said if he asked people what they wanted, they would want faster horses.
Right.
Um,
mhm.
and I brought up Rubin's, just checked again, Rubin's SAMR model. I think we're talking about this kind of idea. We have this new thing, and we're using it in
Oh
the
yeah.
old ways. And
Hmm.
so, yeah, you can use any of these chat bots to write an email. That's fine. But as we work with them more and more, we are going to get to these new affordances of what can really be done. And I think, it's going to take a while for people to really understand how these things can be used. To continue the car analogy, we could think of it as here we have kit cars now, right? Here's the engine, and over there, using Notebook LM or any of these other RAGs, like you say, Rubens worked on several of them. We can construct a fiberglass body, and we can make it look like a Ferrari or we can make it look like a Beetle. Doesn't really matter. And then the whole point, of course, is then to be able to drive the thing on Whittier Boulevard and show it off to people or to use it to get someplace. And that's where, we're just thinking about that or talking about that when we're talking with machines.
Hey, that was slick. That was good. That was very good.
Yep.
The only, I mean, I appreciate this push, Tom, and just on a personal level, um, I have a hard time doing Notebook LM simply because I rarely have a time when I can listen to something in an extended way and also work with it with my hands. So you're typing a response. Usually when I listen to podcasts, I don't have my hands free.
You
I'm
got to get
working.
past the idea of using it for podcasts. Most of the
Yeah.
time I'm using it, I don't do the podcast generation.
Then well, thank you. I
I
mean,
use it as a personal mini database that I can
oh,
access, a bookshelf where I can pull out not just the book, but the part of the book that I need, right?
oh, that's really neat. I do wonder if I wonder if my love of the facilitation function is another version too, because I find most people haven't thought of it or even heard of it, even and but I don't think it's a body so much as really taking the engine out in a different direction. So maybe what we need is we need some kind of chassis built on top of it for that.
Well,
But Mark,
there's some real teaching out possibilities here. You can put the idea is that you could put all of your readings and then have the students run queries and figure out their own solutions to problems based on the readings as a way of accessing them in a more efficient way. And you could give them a whole library, like I did with the assessment conference a few weeks ago, except for the fact that I couldn't get it to work right. But
oh,
uh, well, I think if I were doing it in a classroom situation, I wouldn't. Workshops might be still a little challenging given the time constraints. But in a class, I could set everybody up in the notebook beforehand and take my time with it. In that part of it, the logistics of it get a little easier there. Um, but you could put all the readings from your class in there, and then they could have a much deeper understanding of and explore them by asking it questions that make that and that's not cheating in my book. How much if you give a student a textbook, especially an undergraduate with the regular textbook, how much of that are they actually A, going to read, and B, going to remember? And the answer on both of those questions is depressingly small after being a teacher for 20 years, 20 plus years in the classroom. The that to me is, a more efficient way of getting them to learn, right? So you could do that. you could put your syllabus and all your readings into a notebook LM, and you don't have to you can have them make a podcast, but you have to explain to them the limitations of that. But you can also then have live queries in class where you say, okay, well, let's see if somebody's talked about this particular idea, and then have it pull up out of the readings. And if you put entire books in there, maybe even something you've forgotten, I certainly would have that happen to me. So,
Well, that's one of the great things about writing, is that it exceeds our memory.
yeah.
I want to circle back to something that Mark said. Mark is talking about RAG, and I'm wondering if you could just unfold that a bit more. First, if you could describe RAG for people who might not know what this is, and then if you could just say a bit more about how RAG comes into Tom's idea of ever shrinking LLMs.
Well, luckily, with one click, I can say that IBM says that RAG is an AI framework for retrieving facts from an external knowledge base to ground large language models, LLMs, on the most accurate, up-to-date information and to give users insight into the LLM's generative process. So I think we've already basically said that. You're giving it boundaries. Um, but I guess, the idea of the external knowledge base. So you're giving it, another training set that it may or may not have somewhere in there, but you're making it explicit. And as I said, it's another layer. Found it very useful in again, since it's a Google product and my graduate institute that I work with is a Google Workspace institution. Um, we were trying to, so I'm on a committee, the Learning Experience Design Committee that we created a couple years ago to help maneuver our institution after accreditation as a distance learning institute. And most of our faculty, they're semi-volunteers. It's a alternative institution that's turning 50 this year, founded in Berkeley, California. And so it's kind of an old hippie place. And our faculty kind of reflects that, and they're mostly technophobes. And yet we have to now fulfill our accreditation. And so we created this new committee. They named it after my interest, learning experience design, and making everything transitioning from what they used to do on the telephone or in person on the lawn to distance education. So it's quite a challenge. So I say all that to set up in our committee, we had been meeting, for a year or more than a year, and somebody asked us, "So, what's your committee do?" And we didn't know how to answer that, and so I went back and fed in 2 years worth of meeting notes, and then the mission of the institution, and then some other supplemental documents, and then asked, "What is the mission of this committee?" And it listed out what we had been talking about most, and it pointed us to the several areas that we're most interested in. So that's a really small use and yet very helpful, because I did not want to read through all of those minutes. Now, the minutes were taken by a human. They weren't transcriptions. And so you can see that as this builds out, there are going to be more layers. I do have to point out, though, that I constantly, in my talking about AI, unquote, what I call LLMs, there is randomness and there is what they call hallucinations, I call bullshit, based on Harry Frankfurt's philosophical treatise on bullshit, that all of these things are designed to answer questions. And we ask it a question and it will give us an answer. And so we just have to be aware that, no matter how we use these things, that, everything has to be checked. And this is going to take me, we are approaching the limit. And we almost got to, and then we sort of got onto the car analogy, but we almost got to agentic AI. And I want us to wrap on where we're going with these different large language models and the fact that the corporations are introducing this concept of agentic AI and offering us um, chat bots, if you want to call them that, that will attend Zoom meetings for us or will write emails for us. And I'd like us to end on that topic if we can.
I'll share in the chat one of my favorite parodies, which is the old Microsoft version of trying to do this, which was Clippy. Agentic is interesting. Starting from where we are just now in this conversation, we don't have we might have a national difference. It looks like China isn't really pushing hard on agentic AI. That's something that it might not fit well into the Chinese digital ecosystem, which is quite different from the U.S. Partly because obviously the Chinese government supervision, but also the really intertwined mobile applications. Um, but uh, but it might be that the U.S. leads the way in agentic AI. Um, Clippy is the famous, much hated Microsoft attempt to do this before, and the one I was going to share with you, if I can upload it, is a parody which says, "It looks like you're trying to write a suicide note. How would you like to do it? With gas or with knife or with your gun? But I think agentic AI has some real advantages. You think about the amount of time saving that can be done for certain tasks. But right now it has a minefield to negotiate, not only in terms of privacy, but also in terms of efficiency. Right now the agentic devices that I've seen so far have been flawed, and you don't want it to make a movie reservation for you and send you to the Russ Meyer retrospective when you wanted to see Leonardo DiCaprio or something. Um, I I think it has some interesting advantages in terms as well of um, possibly communication, especially when communication doesn't seem especially meaningful. If I'm writing a note to you two, I'd rather do it myself. But if I'm dealing with a bank and it's just a processing question, I'm happy to outsource that. It does lead to the fun vision that people have of computers writing to computers, and this is the intermediate layer I've spoken of before, where we have an AI layer between people. So have my AI call your AI, and we'll set it up basically.
But that
Uh,
already exists. I mean, in the job search world,
yep,
the
yep,
AIs are filtering
hmm
the job applications, which is why I don't have any problem having an AI write my cover letter, because if
exactly.
anything, it's going to be more appealing to the AI on the other side and more likely to get through if I have an AI do it than rather than my own twisted mind. So I'll finish with a quick anecdote from one of my favorite movies, but the movie Real Genius from the
Mm,
80s, the scene where they are the classroom starts out with the professor sitting there lecturing to the students. Then the students start bringing tape recorders. Then the students disappear, and
right.
and the professor is just lecturing to the tape recorders. And then the professor disappears, and the tape recorder is playing to the tape recorders. And how many activities do we do, and how much of education is like that? Is that meaningful communication, right? And so those are the kinds of questions that AI unfortunately surfaces, and I think is honestly one of the reasons why faculty in particular are very resistant to this idea of AI, because at some level they may realize how much they have to change their practice to not just simply be spewing out meaningless communication. And as a teacher, I have to fight that all the time. And as an educational consultant, it's kind of a running at large, jousting at windmills with large pikes pointed at me. So
Do you think, Tom, in your shrinking model, not that the model is shrinking, but it's a model describing shrinking, do you think that we'll see individual schools running their own LLMs?
I think that's entirely possible. I don't see why not. The biggest thing is it's like everything else. Where are you going to spend your time? Are you going to spend your time running and supporting an LLM or something like that? It's the same thing. We went through this process with LMSs, right? where originally a lot of schools ran their own learning management systems, but eventually they ended up outsourcing that, not because, in part because they didn't want to have the people, their own people, pay their people to do it. That's the main reason, but it created a better, it's just some small subset of people. So I can see by the more along the lines of a reclaim hosting model where they run your WordPress
Yeah.
for you. So you don't have to understand all of the ins and outs of server administration of a WordPress server. You just load up your thing but it's running WordPress, and I could just as easily be running that on my own server, but it makes more sense to have Jim Groom do it for me. Right?
Well,
Good
I think
good good place to
I think
finish there.
we could stop here.
Yeah.
We've worked through your model and with a great deal of thinking. I really appreciate the
And I
two of you.
appreciate that.
I would just say that in my teaching around AI, I've moved agency to the forefront, the human agency.
Hmm.
And so I've decided to emphasize that because all this other is moving at a faster pace than any of us can keep up with. Um, and so that's where I've been focusing my thinking is on on securing the agency of the people using these things and making sure that they're aware of the limitations and yet aware of the affordances.
We
So
need to be
with that,
augmenting human intellect.
exactly, exactly. So with that, I'm going to thank you both and say thank you for listening to this episode of Talking with Machines.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, for hosting.